Really honored to be here. For one, you're a great group. I came here last year and was just like, what an amazing crowd. And then the other reason is that I always feel a little bit, honored as an academic to be invited into a space with roasters. So, thank you for inviting me. So I thought if we were going to do something a little bit academic, let's make it edgy. So we're not going to have you sleeping. And the theme I was looking at the theme for the forum this year being sustainability, and that's, I suppose, where I come in. I research climate change and coffee, and I'm specifically looking at Guatemala, who sells to a value chain that retails. Has anyone heard of Costco in North America? They sell their coffee to Costco. So so anyway, it's a really interesting value chain. The context here is that, and many of you might know this, but climate change is poised to affect coffee production quite negatively. So just for me to get a sense of that from you, who has some experience of strange, impacts from the climate, from changes in climate in their area? Has anyone? What kinds of things have you noticed?
Irregularities.
Irregularities, exactly. Irregularities in what people can expect from the weather patterns in their area. And so this is interesting research, and it's debatable however you look at it, but it's somewhere between, oh dear, hold on a second. Somewhere between 50 and 80% of production is at risk of being threatened over the next decade. So what I'd like to talk about today is adaptation. Now that's a particular word, and I wonder, when you hear that word, what comes to mind? I just like to get a sense of what you hear when you hear that, especially perhaps from people who know origin. What kinds of things do you think about when you hear of adaptation to climate change in the context of coffee? Moving to higher elevations, and then this hand here?
Shade.
Shade, more shade. Anybody else? Irrigation. Maybe let's hear one more.
Variety.
Different varieties, great. So that helps me. So if we look at the word adaptation in the Oxford English Dictionary, it's to become adapted to new conditions, right? The IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says, okay, adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. Okay, so now we're getting a little more detailed. But what does that actually mean? So what happens then? Often we take climate change as, okay, well, it's going to happen, and we just have to change to it. We just have to adapt to it and find a way to react and still keep our coffee growing and keep our communities intact and keep existing. But do you see what just happened there? We just assumed, okay, climate change is going to happen. It's a given. It's an assumption. Now we're just going to try and scramble under it, right? And so often adaptation, as we just heard from about 5 people here, ends up kind of being put on the producer end of this. It's about, producers finding a way to irrigate better, or, is producers to manage their soil differently, or perhaps, plant different varieties. Sure, experts can help, but often that adaptation happens there. Does that make sense? And so I'm here to sort of, first of all, let's just run through some of those examples. And this is from the 2 regions in Guatemala where I'm doing my research. Some of these look a bit like this. So I'm not sure if you can tell, but this producer has cut a bit of he calls it a media luna, like a half moon around the slope of where he's growing his coffee, and so that water and humidity can kind of gather in this region and keep the plant more moist. And this might be obvious to some of you. It's one of various ways that at the level of the plants on the farm, adaptation, people are trying to adapt. There's lots of examples of that. This is another one. Someone mentioned varieties, new varieties. Sometimes this is local knowledge, often it's expert knowledge. that comes in and says, oh, this is a new hybrid that's resistant to Roya, and people are trying those. It's interesting because in parts of Guatemala, they kind of moved to plant all these new varieties, this one new variety that was particularly resistant to leaf fungus, and then wasn't until later they realized, oh, but the cup is terrible from that particular variety. So it takes a bit of that innovation at origin with outside expertise to get this right. But that's another example, and this is a picture taken by this woman here, Adalexi. These are coffee producers in Huehuetenango in Guatemala. And then this picture here, it's an example of renovating the farm, and you probably heard a lot of this already, but it's another technique people use to adapt to this variability in weather and the impacts of climate change. It's taken by this woman here, and I purposely, I knew it was not in focus, but I kept it in because it was her photo, and she can't read and write, and she was assumed she couldn't therefore take photos, but actually did, and this is one of her photos, and she was ecstatic that this was, but it was her, all of these photos I've taken are an example of how we've been working with coffee producers to explore the issue of climate change through their perspective using photography. So that was her example. She renovates her farm really well to try and manage it well in the face of changing weather. So this is another example, and it's part of a whole series that I'll briefly go through here, diversifying at the farm level. This particular man just has numerous fruit trees as shade on his farm, so that he eats from those. It's not as resilient to on the production side. Like his production still may go down, but he'll still be able to eat and feed his family. Other people are diversifying out of coffee. So these folks, this is tomatoes for sale at Burger King. Moving right into a different area. That's a strategy to adapt to, the variability in weather that people are having difficulty managing. This is another example, right out of coffee into raising chickens for a sale at McDonald's. Those are real examples as of last year. This is another example, diversifying right out of the country entirely. These are from Huehuetenango, just a couple hours from the coffee growing area. This is the border with Mexico, and people ended up there from coffee regions because there wasn't a viable way to make a living in coffee anymore. And then this one, I was walking around this woman's farm with her, and she phones her husband and passes me the phone, and I'm chatting with him on WhatsApp. And I'm assuming he's in the valley across the way, maybe working on a different farm, and he says, oh no, I'm in Louisiana. And I'm thinking, like, what? And so people have migrated right out of the country. And so she's doing her best to manage the farm plus kids and grandkids, and he's in the States illegally. So these are ways people are trying to adapt to a changing climate in coffee. So some of these are effective, and I would say really necessary, and I would frame them as like technical adaptations, meaning things you can do technically to keep your plants producing coffee, right? But sometimes it seems like we're scrambling under a changing climate to become better adapted to a changing climate. And ethically, that's really questionable. Great, who's created climate change? A lot of industrialized countries. But the impacts are being felt in producing regions. And so adaptation just gets put there because that's where the impacts are. Do you see the problem? Yeah, right? So my question is, could we intentionally and consciously adapt not just at the level of the farm and with new techniques, but actually could we adapt the overarching systems in which we live to be more sustainable? So that's really my question, and in a way it takes us clear out of this technical frame on adaptation. I'm not going to really be talking about attempts to irrigate farms. Like, that's necessary, but I believe it's insufficient. So that's kind of my main point here, and we're going to kind of unpack that. I have some ideas how we can proceed taking that into account. So taking into account the necessary side of it, and taking into account the insufficient side. And here's some thoughts. But before I begin, just to say, on the one hand, this is kind of what farmers do. They've always done this. This is a painting from probably, I don't know, 100, 200 years ago from Guatemala. You know, farmers do this. They adapt to variable weather. The problem is, and this is just last year, seems like a very similar picture. On the other hand, this, quote, variable weather isn't just the same old variable weather anymore. It's connected to a global phenomenon that's going to increase. So it's going to continue and exacerbate in an unprecedented degree. So it's not going to be enough anyway, just to do what people have always done. There's wisdom in that. There's knowledge and tons of local wisdom in how people have always adapted, but we're looking at something a little different. So I suggest this is a new global moment, and it's requiring more than partial views and more than parochial views. We need more than just farm level experimentation. So it needs to be sort of like scaled up in terms of what we're trying. It's a complex issue that requires something dynamic and sufficiently complex as a response. And then thirdly, it's an issue we can change at its root, not just react to its impacts. Who created climate change? Humans. We don't have to live under it. We can rethink this. So I have these two metaphors, and they're kind of like dramatic, but why not? One is, you know, if we can strain adaptation just to technical things we're doing, it's like you're really making sure your seatbelt is on. And I actually had this thought when I went on a roller coaster with my 6-year-old daughter, and I'm like really making sure her seatbelt is on because the roller coaster does all these things. And then I look up and I'm like, goodness gracious, I hope this thing stays on the track. And I realized that's exactly what we're talking about here. You know, planting different varieties and making sure that you have a way to irrigate your plants if there's drought, wear your seatbelt. I'm not saying don't, but let's take a look at where this track is headed. Another one is the Titanic. I'm not sure if people know this story, but when it was fairly clear this is going down, someone said, okay, band, play some music, and kind of bring the energy into less panic. And so they actually played right until the thing sunk. And, you know, I don't mean to be so dramatic, but that's kind of what we're doing. It's like, let's just sort of play some violins, move around the furniture on the Titanic, plant some different varieties, and the whole thing is going towards a direction that we don't really want. So let's broaden and deepen what we consider to be adaptation. And the question is how. So here's some thoughts I have, and we can hopefully get into some conversation about this. This is the cooperative in Guatemala that I'm doing research with drew out their value chain. And so the producer and Asasape, they're kind of one and the same because the producers are the cooperative. So, but this is their value chain. And what's interesting about it is they're selling to buyers that buy at a premium and reinvest back into the region for social and ecological benefits. So I think this is building a little bit off of what I did last year. There's more and more, we're changing the way we do value chains to circulate wealth back to producing regions and to capture more value all the way along the chain, particularly at origin. So this to me is adaptation. There's no reason that this can't also be adaptation, to revision and restructure the coffee value chain, which means you guys have a part in it because you're part of that value chain. The other one is you know, these women, they're producing coffee for export. And the women, you know, in this particular region, it was hit really heavily during the armed conflict, and many of the men were disappeared or have had to migrate to the States since. And so a lot of women are the ones running these farms. And they're like, how can we capture a bit more value in this area? And they put their heads together and they thought it out. Gray matter, what Marjorie, is that, yeah, what she was saying. And got this idea to make a small roastery. So a very small percentage of what they export, they actually keep in Huehuetenango and roast it and then sell it. And this notion, this is a cooperative. And so they're actually doing this all the time. If you throw any problem set at this group, what do? They get together, they think it out, they do trainings, they do meetings, they involve their members. And that kind of thing I suggest to you is adaptation. Community strength, collective visioning, drawing on multiple ways of knowing. Our first speaker in this section of talks, I don't know, Chris, I think his name was? I'm not sure if he's here. He said, find out who you might need if there's a hurricane on the East Coast. Who can roast your coffee for you? That's this. That's what I would call like a social adaptation or an interpersonal adaptation. And then this one here it's just it's part of some training materials, actually from the Catholic Church, which is really active in this region. And it's saying confrontación con la realidad, which is like confronting the reality and not conforming to it. So if you just conform to climate change, you're just going to adapt under it and like endlessly plant new varieties, again and again and again. That's just conforming to it instead of confronting it, saying, wait, we want something different here. And so here, this man took this photo, and he's a leader in his region. In this way, sparking new ideas, bringing a different kind of paradigm into how people think about problems. And I suggest to you also that this is a form of adaptation. I would call it kind of like personal adaptation, or just what do you draw on in yourself? Like, where do good ideas come from? They don't come from economic, equations at the end of the day. They come from you. They come from in you, interior to you. So if we're going to keep adaptation in just techniques and new practices, we're kind of doing a disservice to what we actually have available to us, is how I see it. And if we were to see that adaptation is also down here, it's also in how we set up the systems of coffee production, coffee roasting, coffee retail. And it's also here, how do we come together and vision how we want to go about this together and map a pathway that we can all be benefiting from. And then it's also up here in this area of our own interior human dimension, in which we can decide, is this the right track that we want our train on, or do we need to change this track? So lifting it out of technical adaptation into these three, and I think it would be interesting as roasters to consider where are you involved here? Because if we often adaptation just gets put into origin, into producing areas, instead of seeing it as like, whoa, this is part of my responsibility or part of the piece that I bring. And I think in each of these ways, there are likely ways that you can contribute to actually a sustainable adaptation. So that's kind of what I'm thinking here and studying. And I thought, I'm not always entirely sure why you guys invite me, and I'm so honored. But I thought, well, let me just put together some current thoughts that I want to kind of play around with and see what kinds of ideas you might have, and let me learn from it too. So this is actually, it's a paper that I would like to write at some point, and research I'm just pulling together, so it's like really current and kind of uncut, so I'm grateful to you to let me play around with this. And I'd be really interested to have a back and forth of discussion with you about it. But the idea is that if our adaptation strategies for coffee in a context of climate change, let's not just play the violin while the ship is sinking, let's actually turn this ship right around. And I think that we have a chance to do that within, kind of any value chain, but in coffee particularly, because of who's here, like who's in this room is always amazing. And I've had enough time now to experience that across the value chain. It's a fascinating sector. So I think we can do it. Thank you. So I'm not sure how you might want to do questions.
Have a seat.
Okay.